Greetings, everyone. My name is Father Joe Matern, and I am the founder of this Casa Esther Catholic Worker House in Amro, Wisconsin. Thank you for joining us for this Lenten series on doing gospel justice. It will lead us into Holy Week in April, and the title of this particular series is Blessed Are the Peacemakers, which is a Lenten exploration of gospel, nonviolence, and why it matters. We thank you for joining us, as well as thanking our co-sponsors. We send you our Lenten blessings. Enjoy the series.
Good evening. I'm Dave Mueller from Casa Esther Catholic Worker in Amro, Wisconsin. Welcome to our 7th and final event of our Lenten series on gospel nonviolence, titled The Church Returns to Gospel Nonviolence. We are fortunate to have what I like to call two giants in the Catholic peace movement today. Our featured speaker is Marie Dennis from Pax Christi International and the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. And tonight's moderator is Johnny Zakovich, the Executive Director of Pax Christi USA. We are closing our series during Holy Week, and it's the events of Holy Week is where we really gain a clear sight of and encounter the nonviolent Jesus. I'm reminded of Father John Deere's remark in our first session, pointing out to us that the last words of Jesus to the disciples was, "Put down your sword." As we conclude this series, we want to thank all of you for joining us. It is our hope that this Lenten exploration of gospel nonviolence made your Lent more meaningful. A few items. In the next couple of weeks, we will be reaching out to many of you for your evaluation and feedback. We'll also be sending all registrants a link to all the 7 recorded events for you to watch the ones you missed or to rewatch the ones you really liked. Finally, as a reminder, please submit all questions and comments in the chat throughout Marie's presentation and during the Q&A. One more, I'd like to do a shout out to Noelle Marshall. Noelle is part of the Casa Esther Catholic Worker community, and she's been the person behind the curtain, so to speak, as in the tradition of the Wizard of Oz. She's made all of this work. She's produced it, spends hours prepping and then editing all the recordings, and really want to thank her again for making this happen. Okay, Pax Christi is one of our co-sponsors, and so I've asked Johnny to take a few minutes to talk about the work of Pax Christi before he introduces Marie. And so it's my honor and pleasure now to turn this over to Johnny Zakovich. Johnny.
Thanks so much, David, and especially thanks for just hosting this series. I think it's been an incredible undertaking, from watching the videos and all of the incredible people that you've had involved, but also as just one of those disciplines leading up, as Father Joe Matern said, leading up to Holy Week, that it's been a place for people to really mine their discipleship, what it means to follow Jesus, what it means to walk the way of the cross, what it means to walk the way of peace and justice and nonviolence. And this has been just an incredible series for that. And Pax Christi USA is just really grateful to have been asked to be a co-sponsor. So thank you so much, David, for doing that. For folks that aren't familiar with Pax Christi, I just wanted to say a couple words about who Pax Christi is and what it means to be part of the Pax Christi community. A little bit about our history. So Pax Christi USA is a section of Pax Christi International. And Pax Christi International grew out of, first of all, Pax Christi International has sections or member organizations in 120 organizations all over the world on every continent. And we're seeing the most incredible growth in the Pax Christi network in places like, and continents like Africa and Latin America and Asia. And that's just really energizing, I know, for myself and for other folks that have been part of this movement for so long. But Pax Christi International started off in 1945 when a group of French Catholics were looking across that border and recognizing that they shared a common faith with German Catholics and yet had slaughtered each other by the millions in 2 wars over a period of 30 years. And so they came together, French and German Catholics, professing the same faith, celebrating the same Eucharist, And they wanted to figure out, what is this? How can we do that? How can we share the same faith, believe in the same God, and yet kill each other by the millions? So they prayed together for forgiveness, for reconciliation, and they gave birth to a movement that was built on Pax Christi, the peace of Christ. And it's a movement that since 1945 has really spread all over the world, as I mentioned. Here in the United States, Pax Christi USA began in 1972, and we're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. And Pax Christi USA was birthed by really the initiative of a handful of US Catholics, mostly lay Catholics, who came together, and they came together as veterans of the anti-war movement and the farm workers movement and the civil rights movement. And what they shared in common was political action and the spiritual discipline that came from their faith that required them to a witness, a discipleship that was based on the reign of God, the reign of peace, the reign of justice in the world. And so this small group of Catholics came together in 1972. Some of them you might recognize their names, people like Dorothy Day, for instance, who was there at the beginning, or Bishop Tom Gumbleton. And they started Pax Christi USA. And over the years, Pax Christi USA has had this incredible flexibility to change and adapt as the world has changed. We're not a single issue organization. We embrace a variety of issues. And what shapes our identity faithfully is bringing the message of the gospel to bear on what is happening in the world by reading the signs of the times. Whether it meant addressing the nuclear arms race or the Vietnam War, whether it meant being at the forefront of the sanctuary movement and solidarity with those communities that were struggling under the oppression of colonization and US foreign policy, like in Latin America, places like El Salvador and Guatemala. Whether it was the death penalty. In the 90s, we saw Pax Christi USA deeply involved in solidarity work with Haiti, but also embracing the new cosmology movement that examined our relationship to the earth and examined who we were in a world that was no longer defined by East-West relationships, by the Cold War and the war-peace paradigm, but by the new realities which were posed by the global South and the global North, that lens of oppression and liberation and issues like economic justice here at home and abroad. I'm particularly proud that Pax Christi USA was one of the first Catholic organizations to explore our own work through the lens of anti-racism beginning in the late 90s. And that 20+ year initiative is still going on, transforming Pax Christi USA into an anti-racist, multicultural Catholic peace and justice movement. And it's so central to who we are. I hope that for those of y'all on this call, especially people that are associated with Catholic colleges, that if you're looking for a home within the Catholic Church, if you're looking for a Catholic home that embraces all of the broad spectrum of identity that Catholics share, whether it be pro-LGBTQIA, whether it be pro-peace, whether it be working for racial justice and committed to racial equity in the world, that Pax Christi USA might be exactly the kind of place, the kind of community that you want to be a part of. So consider this an invitation to check Pax Christi USA out, and I'll post a couple links in the chat here in just a couple minutes if you want to check Pax Christi USA out. And we hope, especially during this 50th anniversary year, that you might find something there that calls you to want to associate, to be part of this community, to share in this discipleship journey with us and work for peace and justice, which is the reign of God in the world today. So I'm grateful for David allowing me to say a few words about Pax Christi USA. And I'm also really aware that the person that I'm about to introduce is foundational for Pax Christi USA's history. I have had the pleasure of knowing Marie for many years, and the breadth and depth of her witness is something that I don't think anyone can deny, that she has been at the forefront of this movement to place gospel nonviolence at the heart of what it means to be the Catholic Church. And I thought it was particular apropos that the title of today's talk is "The Church Returns to Gospel Nonviolence." Gospel nonviolence is not something new. It's not an add-on that suddenly is in vogue within the Catholic Church, but it may be the most conservative value that the church should have, because it is the value of Jesus. It is the value that goes back to that original church and was there at the beginning. So Marie Dennis is Senior Advisor to the Secretary General of Pax Christi International, the program chair of Pax Christi's Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. And she was the co-president of Pax Christi International, especially during those years between 2007 and 2019, when we saw Pax Christi really become a worldwide movement. She worked for the Maryknoll Missioners from 1989 to 2012 as the director of the Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns for 15 years and holds a master's degree in moral theology from Washington Theological Union and honorary doctorates from Trinity Washington University and Alvernia University. She's the author or co-author of 7 books, including being the editor of Choosing Peace, The Catholic Church Returns to Gospel Nonviolence, and co-editor of Advancing Nonviolence in the Church and the World. Marie was named Person of the Year by the National Catholic Reporter in 2016, and she serves on the Vatican's COVID-19 Commission and the Steering Committee of the Catholic Peacebuilding Network, and has previously served on the national boards of Just Faith Ministry, the Alliance for Peacebuilding, Sojourners Magazine, and so many others. She was the founder of the Ecumenical Center for New Creation, which was dedicated to education and action for social justice and peace, the Washington, D.C. Area Community Investment Fund, which makes loans for affordable housing and small businesses in low-income communities, the Jubilee USA campaign, which was for cancellation of overwhelming and unjust debt of impoverished countries, and the Assisi community, which is a small, intentional Catholic community that's been witnessing for peace and justice for over 30 years in inner city DC. She's a laywoman, a secular Franciscan, a mother of 6, a grandmother of 9, and she strives to live simply and lightly on the earth, as well as to work for social transformation. Before moving to Assisi community in 1997, where she continues to live, Marie and her family lived on and worked a 65-acre organic farm in Virginia. So when David talks about giants of the Catholic peace and justice world, I think there's one on this call, and then there's a guy who's hanging out on the fringes who's introducing her. It's great pleasure that I get to introduce to you one of my mentors, one of the people I most admire in the world, and really who is a giant in this work for peace and justice from a faith-based perspective, Marie Dennis. Marie, it's all yours.
Thank you, Johnny. You're very generous, and it's very lovely to be on the screen with you. A big thank you to Casa Esther, to Dave, and to all who have put together what is really an extraordinary series of reflections and talks on gospel nonviolence. I'd like to begin our reflection tonight with a prayer for peace that was recited by Pope Francis several weeks ago. I think you can hear in this prayer the angst, the pain that Pope Francis is feeling right now about the lack of peace on earth. Forgive us for the war, Lord. Lord Jesus, Son of God, have mercy on us sinners. Lord Jesus, born under the bombs of Kiev, have mercy on us. Lord Jesus, dead in the arms of a mother in Kharkiv, have mercy on us. Lord Jesus, in the 20-year-old sent to the front line, have mercy on us. Lord Jesus, who continues to see hands armed with weapons under the shadow of the cross, forgive us. Forgive us if not content with the nails with which we pierced your hands, we continue to drink from the blood of the dead, torn apart by weapons. Forgive us if these hands that you have created to protect have been turned into instruments of death. Forgive us, Lord, if we continue to kill our brother, if we continue like Cain to take the stones from our field to kill Abel. Forgive us if we go out of our way to justify cruelty, if in our pain we legitimize the cruelty of our actions. Forgive us the war, Lord. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, we implore you to stop the hand of Cain, enlighten our conscience. Let not our will be done. Do not abandon us to our own doing. Stop us, Lord, stop us. And when you have stopped the hand of Cain, take care of him also. He is our brother. O Lord, Stop the violence. Stop us, Lord. Amen. So again, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this wonderful series. I've watched many of the prior speakers and enjoyed it very much. It's been a really impressive to see the scope of what you have discussed. You're already light years ahead of so many people who have a very narrow and incomplete understanding of violence and nonviolence. The current war in Ukraine is not only a catastrophe in itself, it already has begun to fuel a new arms race and to make nuclear abolition much less likely. At a time when the world urgently needs to address climate change and to meet the needs of the most marginalized and impoverished communities, the Ukraine war is taking us in a calamitous direction. We have to replace the logic of violence in which we are mired with a new logic of nonviolence. Pope Francis' condemnation of the war could not be clearer. War is madness, he said. Wars are always unjust. The moment has come to abolish war, to erase it from human history before it erases human history. Enough, he said. Stop it. May the weapons be silenced. Let us be serious about peace. But it will not be enough to hope for a new world. We together have to build it. And we in Pax Christi are convinced that nonviolence is the only way to do so. Throughout Lent, you have been learning about and hopefully practicing nonviolence. You know that nonviolence is broader than pacifism. It is a spirituality, a way of life, and a universal ethic at the core of our humanity. It's more than an ideal. It's more than an aspiration. As we've been seeing in Ukraine, nonviolence, from civil resistance to diplomacy and negotiations, can be a very effective tool on the way to just peace. We're not only talking about war, of course. You have been thinking already about the many manifestations of violence, War and direct physical violence are one form of violence, but structural, systemic, and cultural violence are equally important. Racism is violence. Oppression is violence. Economic injustice is violence. Environmental destruction is violence. Apartheid is violence. The list is very long. You know that. So please bear with me as I share my screen and would like to share a few slides with you as we walk through this conversation about the church returning to gospel nonviolence. So I was invited to share with you tonight a bit about the recent journey of the Catholic Church to, as Johnny said, to return to the nonviolent practice of the early Christian communities. And also about the efforts of, now let's see if I can turn the slide here. Yes. And the efforts of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, which is a project of Pax Christi International, which is trying to help the church literally move back in that direction. As I said, the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, as a project of Pax Christi International, began with a few simple questions. What if the 1.3 billion Catholics worldwide had a full understanding of the power and effectiveness of active nonviolence and the connection of nonviolence to the heart of the gospel? What if we all knew how to apply nonviolent tools to defuse conflict before it became violent? What if the Catholic Church committed its channels of communication and diplomacy, its vast spiritual, intellectual, and financial resources to promoting active nonviolence? What if Catholic schools, colleges, universities, seminaries, and beyond integrated programs on nonviolence and just peace into their curricula, their research, and their community outreach efforts? These questions and more were discussed at a small conference on nonviolence and just peace that many of you may have heard about. It was held in Rome in 2016, co-sponsored by the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace and Pax Christi International. And I just want to put a little footnote there. The fact that the Vatican co-sponsored a conference with Pax Christi International was an extraordinary achievement and really quite surprising. Pope Francis has made a lot of changes even there. Among the 80 or so participants in that conference were many people living in contexts of violence and war, from Iraq and Afghanistan, from Palestine and Uganda, from South Sudan and Colombia, Guatemala, Mexico, Sri Lanka, and on and on. Many participants, including from the Philippines, had deep experience with effective nonviolence under extremely challenging circumstances. One of the participants, Iraqi Dominican sister Nazik Mati, whose community was expelled from Mosul by ISIS just shortly before our conference was held. The community lost everything that they had. Sister Nazik said, quote, "War is the mother of ignorance, isolation, and poverty. Please tell the world there is no such thing as a just war. I say this as a daughter of war," she said. "We can't respond to violence with worse violence." Jesuit Francisco de Rue, who is now the lead person in the Truth Commission in Colombia, who was also a participant in the conference, talked about the use of the just war paradigm by all sides, the guerrillas, the paramilitaries, and the official army during Colombia's civil war to rationalize what became 50 years of killing, of kidnapping, and of enormous destruction. What they and others shared with us in those few days helped us to think much more deeply about the nature of violence and to begin to develop a deeper, more nuanced, and more complex understanding of nonviolence as an approach that is actively working to stop repression and violence, but is also working to promote social justice, human dignity, and a healthy planet. You already understand that nonviolence is a spirituality, a way of life, a global ethic, and a very diverse set of tools for preventing or interrupting violence, for defending people at risk, for transforming conflict, for promoting social justice, and for working to protect ecological integrity. In other words, nonviolence is not passive. It does not try to avoid conflict. And again, it is not the same as pacifism. Nonviolence actively transforms conflict and resists direct, structural, cultural, and environmental violence. Nonviolence works for a more just and compassionate world. You remember from John Deere's talk, the first talk in this series, that in first century Palestine, where direct and structural violence were a way of life, think of the Roman occupation, but also of the way that religious rules and rituals were being used to exclude whole groups of people, lepers, women, and so on. In that space, in that context, Jesus, as John says so well, proclaimed a new nonviolent way of life that was rooted in radical inclusion, the beloved community, the unconditional love of God. With John, you reflected on Jesus' call to nonviolent discipleship. Jesus taught his disciples to love their enemies, to turn the other cheek. When he stopped her accusers from stoning the woman caught in adultery, and when on the night before he died, he told Peter to put away his sword, as we heard tonight, Jesus marked out the path of nonviolence. He walked that path to the very end of his life, to the cross, where he took the evil, the violence, upon himself rather than inflicting it on others, and overcame it by his suffering and death. Jesus' resurrection from the dead was what John calls the vindication of nonviolence over violence. Those of us gathered at the 2016 conference appealed directly to the church to write an encyclical on nonviolence, to promote gospel nonviolence, to integrate gospel nonviolence into the life and the work of the church at every level, to promote the development of nonviolent practices and strategies, to lift up the prophetic voices of peacemakers and nonviolent activists around the world, and to move the just war tradition further into the background of Catholic teaching. The Catholic Nonviolence Initiative grew out of that 2016 conference as a project of Pax Christi International. We were delighted when just a few months later, Pope Francis wrote his 2017 World Day of Peace message on nonviolence, a style of politics for peace. And we've been in pretty continuous dialogue with the Vatican, primarily the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development since then. If you have not read the 2017 World Day of Peace message, I strongly encourage you to do that, and I'll give you the link at the end of this session. In his World Day of Peace message in 2017, Pope Francis offered a significant reflection on the practical application, including by public policies of nonviolent approaches to just or integral peace. He talked about nonviolence both as a personal virtue rooted in human dignity and as a political strategy with justice and equity at the center. Nonviolence is powerful, he said, and potentially very effective, with roots in dialogue, respect, concern for the good of the other, mercy, and forgiveness. He said that an ethics of fraternity and peaceful coexistence between individuals and among peoples cannot be based on the logic of fear, the logic of violence, and closed-mindedness, but on responsibility, respect, and sincere dialogue. He offered a specific challenge, very interestingly, to political leaders, the heads of international institutions, and business and media executives to apply the Beatitudes in the exercise of their respective responsibilities, to show mercy by refusing to discard people, harm the environment, or seek to win at any cost, to choose solidarity as a way of making history and building friendship in society, an interesting appeal to business leaders and political leaders. In asking the church to replace the just war tradition with a new moral framework based on nonviolent practice for its teaching on violence and war, we were in fact building on a tradition that was already moving in that direction. Given what we now know about the consequences of horrific violence and war, the cost in human life that is so visible in Ukraine, but equally horrifying in Yemen and Syria and in too many other places, given what we know also about the psychological trauma, moral injury, environmental damage, climate disruption, and on, and given the vast resources spent on preparations for war, resources that are desperately needed, we have been seeing so clearly during the pandemic, for healthcare, food security, education, for integral human development, the official church has been saying for a while that a, quote, just war, one that meets all of the criteria for a so-called just war, the church has been saying, is practically impossible. Pope John the 23rd in Pacem in Terris, which is almost 60 years ago, a year from now, the Second Vatican Council in Gaudium et Spes, Pope Paul VI at the United Nations, Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI repeated that warning. But the just war tradition continued to remain at the center of Catholic teaching on war, and nations, especially our own, continued to spend vast fortunes. The proposed military budget for this year, fiscal year 2022, was $775 billion, and it is now, the Congress is facing a request for an increase in the military budget. The vast fortunes spent on weapons and preparations for war are in stark contrast to the very little that is spent studying nonviolence or preparing nonviolent alternatives. Maslov was right, who said, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And there are many examples of that you can certainly remember. I was particularly conscious when the Yazidis were caught on top of the mountain in the northern part of Iraq, the same campaign that had so affected the Dominican sisters there. I remember people being frantic about needing to help the Yazidis. What could we do? And we were saying more bombs, more military spending is not the answer. But what we needed were fully developed, effective, nonviolent tools and strong incentive to use them. And we just had not spent the resources that were needed to do that. Pope Francis himself has taken truly monumental steps toward the nonviolent world he referenced in the World Day of Peace message. Other speakers have referred to these steps, but they really are monumental. One step was his absolute opposition to the death penalty, actually changing the catechism to reflect new Catholic teaching that rules out any excuse for capital punishment. Another was his complete rejection of deterrence, of nuclear deterrence, in November of 2017, when he called the very possession of nuclear weapons to be morally indefensible. Finally, in Fratelli Tutti, his most recent encyclical, Pope Francis explicitly moved the just war tradition off center stage in Catholic teaching. It was a huge step in the right direction, and one that was a surprise at that time. It's still being debated here and there, but it was a very clear, very small reference in that encyclical. I'm sure you've probably read Fratelli Tutti. If you've not, I encourage you to read it. And notice in particular the footnotes in the area where he's talking about the just war tradition. It's very, very interesting, very subtle. It was interesting because following our conference in 2016, when we called for an end to the teaching of the just war tradition, we got a lot of reactions from people who thought that was a really bad idea. And so as we tried to move nonviolence forward in church teaching, we had been emphasizing nonviolence. What is violence? What is nonviolence? And not particularly emphasizing the just war tradition. So it was a delightful surprise when Pope Francis just stepped right in and took care of it himself. At the same time, it is really important to realize that we are not talking about passivity. Ethical norms to guide political decision makers in a world that is extremely violent, as we've seen in the last few weeks, are still necessary. Many such norms are well ensconced in international humanitarian law. It's been interesting even in the news coverage of the war in Ukraine here. What we've been hearing a lot about is the violation of international law, of international humanitarian law, a violation of the rules of war, so to speak, that have become very clear. That civilians are to be protected, that it is not that a building with a red cross on the roof is not a legitimate target, that a hospital is not fair game, and on and on. Many of those criteria are written into international humanitarian law. But would also be included, some of the same criteria would also be included in a new just peace moral framework with a focus on nonviolence and on the long-term process of building right relationships among humans and between humans and the earth, which is the global ethic that nonviolence is articulating, is in which nonviolence is included. Nonviolence is not simple or straight. Think of Myanmar or think of Ukraine. I'm sorry, nonviolence is not simple or safe. Those committed to nonviolence often risk injury or death. A nonviolent struggle for just peace may take years, and the path of nonviolence will be far from linear. But evidence is clear, and another speaker referenced the research that is done in this area. The evidence is clear that the outcome of a nonviolent campaign will be much more sustainable and much more participative, that more people will be able to participate in a nonviolent campaign, making it much more likely to be successful and to lead to a more just, more democratic society. So what we know is that nonviolence can be many different, have many different expressions. So for example, public demonstrations are certainly a form of nonviolence. Civil disobedience is a form of nonviolence. But there also are a myriad of other, not always visible, resistance actions, such as staying home, music and art, and on, that are also very powerful and very important. I'm sure you know about Gene Sharp's 198 methods of nonviolent action. Michael Beer, who is now at Nonviolence International, has recently published a really interesting book entitled Civil Resistance Tactics in the 21st Century, that explores the expanding universe of nonviolent tactics, including the use of new technologies, of social media, and so on. I'll post these references in the chat before we finish. The war in Ukraine has examined every possible angle, what has been happening in that war. The shocking, deliberate, unjustified Russian attacks on civilians and essential infrastructure, the deep complexity of root causes and culpability, including on the part of NATO and the United States, the clash of worldviews and interests, the mind and motives of Russian President Vladimir Putin, the impact of nationalism and disinformation, the role of the Russian Orthodox and other churches, the palpable threat of nuclear or chemical warfare, the usefulness of just war or of a just peace framework. All of those dimensions of this war are being debated and discussed. But critically important stories about creative, active nonviolence in Ukraine and in Russia must also be told. For example, I'm going to just run through a couple of slides that are wonderful examples of what has been happening in Ukraine and in Russia in the last weeks during this war. Digital road signs in Ukraine were posted that talked about all roads leading to The Hague and the International Criminal Court, and so on. Russian soldiers, stop. Putin lost. The whole world stands with Ukraine. Go away without blood on your hands. Russian soldiers, stop. Don't kill your soul for Putin's oligarchs. Russian soldiers, stop. How will you be able to look your kids in their eyes? Go away, stay human. Very powerful signs that have been posted along the roads in Ukraine. So wonderful picture of a Ukrainian welding an anti-tank obstacle that have been put in the middle of the roads. nonviolent resistance. Another wonderful picture of a concert in the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv on the steps down to the subway, to the underground where people were sheltering. Another beautiful picture of in the middle of the capital of, oh no, this was in Lviv, the symphony orchestra playing in the middle of the square, the public square, even as Russia was invading their country. Beautiful picture, beautiful images of nonviolent action. And in Russia, I'm sure you've seen some of these pictures of this woman who was protesting, was arrested, taken away by the police, and they said she was back in short order protesting again. And that's under threat of very severe penalties in Russia. The courage that people have had has been remarkable. I'm sure you heard the story of the woman who walked across saying no to war on one of the Russian television channels. A very courageous action on her part. So those stories, we believe, are extremely important to tell. And we need to look for ways to support the nonviolent activists in Ukraine and elsewhere around the world. So during 2017 and 2018, the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative held 5 virtual roundtables that engaged theologians and peace practitioners literally from around the world. In regular, about once a month, we would come together on whatever platform we were using then, it was pre-Zoom, for regular reflection that we hoped would deepen our understanding of different aspects of nonviolence. One group was looking at a foundational theology of nonviolence, another on the biblical foundations of Jesus' nonviolence. A third was looking at a new moral framework based on nonviolence that would emphasize just peace and be able to replace the just war tradition. Another was looking at examples, case studies of nonviolence applied by Catholic communities in very different contexts of violence around the world. And the fifth was looking at proposals for how the church could integrate nonviolence into its life and mission. The results of these roundtable conversations formed the basis of a second conference that was also, well, it was co-sponsored by the Dicastery for Integral Human Development, which had been created between our 2 conferences. And it was co-sponsored by Pax Christi International again. Again, we gathered about 80 people from around the world in Rome for a conference that was entitled The Path of Nonviolence Toward a Culture of Peace. The roundtable results have also been collected in a book published in 2020 by Pax Christi International called Advancing Nonviolence and Just Peace in the Church and the World, which is available in English, Spanish, German, and partly in French. Since then, the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative has been in very regular dialogue with the Vatican, still encouraging a deeper ownership of the Vatican, of nonviolence by the Vatican. Both we've been in direct conversation with, especially the Dicastery, but also have been contributing to almost any opportunity that was made available to us to participate in church events sponsored by the Vatican, the one on nuclear disarmament, another on cybersecurity, another celebrating the anniversary of Caritas in Veritate, another on ending the manufacturing and sales or marketing of weapons, and another on new technologies for peace. And then also we were given the opportunity, we proposed to the Vatican that they host a retreat on gospel nonviolence that we put together at Christmas a year and a few months ago that attracted about 750 participants. It was really a lovely event. Again, I will put the references to these, where the location of these references in the chat shortly. We've been very actively participating in the Vatican's COVID-19 Commission, particularly on the Security Task Force. And I smiled during that process. The process that the commission used was to ask for papers for contributions from all those who were participating around a particular theme. And it was a great exercise for us because no matter what was the assignment, our answer was nonviolence. But we had to tailor our response about nonviolence to demonstrate the depth and reach of nonviolence in many, many different circumstances. We've also been contributing to the Laudato Si action platform. I suspect many of you are as well, but we've been trying to make clear the essential connection between nonviolence and a future that reflects the spectacular and beautiful vision of Laudato Si. I'm sure some of you may have participated in or watched the dialogue between Pope Francis and representatives of students in different Catholic universities in the US. It was really a beautiful exchange. And two of the participants were very specific in making this particular connection between nonviolence and care for the earth, and have proposed that every Catholic university, I think, in the country establish a center for training in nonviolence so that the work for Laudato Si would be even stronger. We've been in ongoing conversation also with local churches through religious congregations, a number of bishops from Japan, the Middle East, Germany, Canada, Italy, Peru, Kenya, South Africa, the US have participated in small Zoom conversations about nonviolence in their diocese or in their context. What does violence look like, we asked, and is there a way to apply nonviolent strategies in response? And we've also been in touch with a number of international Catholic organizations whose work is specific, but lifts up the power of nonviolence. Caritas International, for example, Catholic Relief Services, Jesuit Refugee Service, and we've got lots more work to do there. We're also still listening very carefully to people from different contexts, believing that nonviolence in the context of occupation in Palestine, nonviolence in the context of poverty or street violence in Haiti, nonviolence from the perspective of liberation theologians in Latin America or elsewhere, nonviolence in Eastern Europe facing war and a very uncertain future, nonviolence intersecting with structural racism in the United States, nonviolence in post-colonial Africa, nonviolence in Myanmar following the military coup, nonviolence in Asia and the Pacific, where the nuclear threat is still very real, that all of those examples will look very different. I love the example that I heard somewhere along the way of a practice in Mali in West Africa of when there's a conflict in the community, someone in the community is given the responsibility of dressing up wildly in a kind of jester outfit and just being foolish until the people in conflict finally let go of their conflict and join the fun. So very interesting. Especially gratifying has been the response of Catholic universities and colleges in the United States, but in a number of other countries as well. These different educational institutions have sponsored conferences and symposia on nonviolence. They were each somewhat different, depending on the focus of the area where they are located or of their own program of studies. For example, at San Diego University in San Diego, which has such a very strong military presence, the university created an opportunity for dialogue between ourselves and the ethicists at all of the military academies in the United States. It was fascinating, very interesting. They have organized workshops and panel discussions, trainings on nonviolence in all kinds of locations, at retreat centers, at universities, religious communities. They've promoted the inclusion of nonviolence and peace in their curricula at a variety of different levels. And they've encouraged students to do either undergraduate or graduate level research on the effectiveness of nonviolent approaches in different contexts. The Catholic Nonviolence Days of Action in September, from September 21st through October 2nd, is an annual opportunity, an event to encourage creative thinking about how to be nonviolent as we act for justice and protect the planet in many different contexts around the world. This last year, the theme connected with the huge work of the Laudato Si Action platform, as well as with Campaign Nonviolence. Oops, one more slide. Finally, quite recently, we published an initial tool for policymakers to help political leaders at every level, local, national, multilateral, international, understand how public policies can help move our societies from perpetually turning to weapons and violence to deal with conflict, and instead to invest in developing and scaling up nonviolent tools like diplomacy, unarmed civilian protection, restorative justice, trauma healing, well-planned and organized civil resistance, even humor, and on, to address conflict that could turn violent. Bishop Robert McElroy from San Diego made my heart sing when he said, "The church must be a voice in the world constantly pointing humanity toward the path of nonviolence and the logic of peace." We know that the obstacles are huge, including the powerful forces behind the big business of making weapons and war. But we believe that we can live our way into this challenge by nurturing a spirituality of nonviolence, by learning to interact with each other, with our neighbors nonviolently, by working for a just peace wherever we're planted, and by advocating for nonviolent ways to conduct the affairs of a broken world. Hopefully, this will give you an initial picture of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, a more complete picture of CNI, and links to the many resources that we've created together or discovered are on our websites, and that I will put this in the link in the chat as well. And obviously, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Marie. That was terrific. And incredible. And one of the things I wanted to point out for folks, when Marie was referencing the World Day of Peace message in 2017, I posted some of the links, Marie, as you talked in the chat, but other ones I'm sure I missed. So anything you want to add? But I want to say that Marie is being a little bit modest, I think, about that World Day of Peace message in 2017. Pope Francis asks for input on those types of things and had reached out to Pax Christi International. And I know Marie was the major voice of, giving input on that document. And I think I'm correct in this. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Marie, but I think you saw about 75 to 80% of what you had submitted for that World Day of Peace message reflected in the Pope's message. So it's nice to have that kind of collaboration and to see the value of your work, make it into the mouth and the words of the Pope. So thanks so much for that, Marie.
Well, we don't say that too much. It was all his work.
That's right. That's right. So one of the questions, Marie, that Zoe had asked and put in the chat pretty early on, I think is a basic one that folks often wonder, what's the difference between pacifism and nonviolence? And I was just maybe wondering if you could say a little bit about that, because the two are often interchanged as if they are the same thing, and they're not. And so I want to just ask you maybe if you could speak to that.
I certainly can try. It's not an easy thing to describe, but I think of pacifism as an inspiring and very legitimate, important option on the part of an individual to never participate in or support violence of any kind. Nonviolence, as I said, is a spirituality, a way of life. We hope it will become a global ethic. It can be a global ethic. And it is a set of tools that respond to conflict or to violence, conflict to prevent violence, or violence already to reduce it, to interrupt it, to protect people, and so on, to address structural and systemic violence. But it doesn't start from a premise of saying there will never be violence, but of applying, especially at a public level, of applying nonviolence in such a way that the possibility of violence or the likelihood of violence will become more and more remote. So I think of nonviolence more as a process, whereas I think of pacifism as a commitment to what we hope will be the ultimate goal of nonviolence.
Thanks, Marie. I think too, one of the ways I've always thought about it is a spectrum, with pacifism sort of being on one end of the spectrum, but people engaging in terms of nonviolence and tactics and strategy and spirituality all along that spectrum, and what it means and whatnot. Thanks. That was I appreciate you helping make that difference, make that distinction for us, Marie. There's another question on here that I wanted to send your way. So the question is, how can you affirm and advise Catholic Christian peacemakers who seek to help U.S. Church peace leadership match the Vatican peace leadership? And again, I think what they're getting at here is often we hear Pope Francis much farther out on that limb than we hear U.S. Church leadership. And what's the disconnect there, or how is it that we can move U.S. Church leadership maybe a little closer to Pope Francis's leadership on this?
I was hoping you all would have that answer. There are, in the United States, as you all know, some extraordinary leaders in the Catholic Church. Some of them are bishops and are very deeply committed to nonviolence. Many others, of course, are leaders of the church who are not part of the bishops' conference, but are leaders in the church who are very deeply committed to nonviolence. I think it's a very long process. I feel like I believe that it is a very important challenge for all of us who live in the United States to find ways to have a conversation, to have a series of conversations, to be in dialogue with our own bishop or with the bishops' conference, if we have the opportunity to do that, to just stay with it. It's been interesting. When right after the 2016 conference, I was asked to speak to the Bishops' Conference International Justice and Peace Committee. It was the first time I was ever asked to do that. I worked in Washington for a long time in justice and peace, and I found, in fact, Bishop McElroy from San Diego followed me out. I had 15 minutes, I think, to talk about this conference. And Bishop McElroy followed me out, and he said, "Did you say that nonviolence and pacifism are different?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I have to think about that." The next time I saw him, he asked me, "Are you saying there's always a nonviolent solution to every violent situation?" And I said, "No, but if we don't invest in developing nonviolent solutions, we will always be mired in an ethic of violence out of which we cannot pull ourselves. That's where we are right now. And it was as though it just made huge sense to him. And he has been a tremendous advocate for deeper thinkings and engagement around nonviolence. I think that's the hard task that we have in front of us. I think the other issue is that in the United States, I believe that often the church tries to engage the debate in realpolitik, that it has to speak in language that politicians will accept and understand. And so nonviolence just feels like a non-starter to politicians. Not all politicians, but a lot. Pope Francis simply stepped out of that boundary when he, in 2014, began to say, there is no good reason to possess nuclear weapons. There is no moral justification for it. He stepped outside of the logic of realpolitik. He created a logic that was consistent with the gospel, and it made the church able to support enthusiastically the Treaty on the Prevention of Nuclear Weapons, Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We just have to stay with it. I don't think there's any easy way, but it is so clear that it's what our faith, that's what Jesus taught us to do. Love your enemy. Love your enemy right now means figure out a way to think about President Vladimir Putin in such a way that you can imagine a future in which he, as a child of God, could also participate. It's really hard.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Marie. And I do think that what we're seeing a little bit of is in the wake of what Pope Francis has sort of liberated space for some US bishops to come forward. I know, Archbishop Wester of Santa Fe, who nonviolence was all over his pastoral letter on nuclear disarmament. Our own Bishop President John Stowe has been outspoken about the role nonviolence plays on a host of issues. I know Bishop Taylor of Little Rock has now written 2 statements on nonviolence over the last year, and even other bishops are treating particular issues through the lens of nonviolence, whether it's Cardinal Supich on gun violence, or whether it's Bishop Lucia in Syracuse talking about the church's treatment of indigenous people and the doctrine of discovery, that they're approaching it from this, with this language of nonviolence or this lens of nonviolence, even if they don't use that word necessarily. So we're seeing, I think, folks sort of start to fill in that space that Pope Francis has created. You ended that last thing by talking about Vladimir Putin, and one of the questions that that someone asked here, Marie, is it's about what's happening in the Ukraine. It says that the Ukrainians took up arms in response to the invasion by Russian troops. Can you paint us a picture of what an alternative, long-term, nonviolent national response may have looked like? And I know that you gave us some examples of nonviolence that's happening in Ukraine right now. But I think what they're asking is, what would have been, maybe one, how do we not end up with a war in the first place, I think is the big question here. And 2, how do we start building the mechanisms that assure that nonviolent responses can happen when conflict brews up like this, happening in Ukraine?
Yeah. I think that's one of the fundamental questions that we're facing right now. To begin with, to avoid the kind of situation that we're seeing in Ukraine right now, requires an understanding of and a commitment to long-term building of both a nonviolent way of life, nonviolent relationships. Apologies if I'm a little distracted. There is I don't know if you can hear the motorbike outside my window, but it's time to be playing it up and down the street. Sorry. the reality of what are the root causes of the war in Ukraine is very complex. And to have ended up in a better place, a more peaceful place than we are now, we needed to be looking at root causes years ago that, for example, how to build a how to imagine security that is security that includes all the nations in across Europe, and then all the way, including Russia. How to not think about maintaining a NATO that supposedly protects some nations over against the enemy. We over long periods of time have built ways of thinking about security, of ensuring security, that almost guarantee that we won't have security, because we will always be provocative or threatening or creating fear in another, or fear in ourselves. So one thing I think is a long-term building of relationships that are not built on fear and threats and enemy making, but on building real security for everybody. That requires a break into what is our economic dependence on the production of weapons and the sale of weapons all over the world. Yes, the United States is a huge, the contribution of weapons production to our economy is tremendous. It is spread all the way across the country. I don't know if it's exactly accurate, but I believe that just about every congressional district in this country has some piece of the military budget that comes back in the form of local investment. But we're not the only ones. There are other countries that produce arms and traffic them and sell them. We need to stop that. That's long-term work. We need to stop investing $700 and $800 billion a year.
800 plus.
800 plus.
The most recent, yeah.
Preparing for war, training people for war, and shift those funds to providing the real security of good healthcare and education and housing and jobs and so on. So the route to a different outcome in Ukraine is a very familiar route. I mean, I think we all know that we need to look at root causes, and we need to root out the root causes. We also do need to deepen our ability to nurture the kind of values that help us become people of peace. And this is a global challenge. And then we need to learn nonviolent strategies for dealing with conflict, because conflict is totally inevitable. How we deal with the conflict is key. So deep root causes, breaking out the military expenditures and all unending preparations for war, building people of peace, people committed to nonviolence, and learning nonviolent strategies that are effective and clear, and all that entails.
Yeah, I'm going to give you an amen on that, Marie. And I also just want to say, we're going to take just a 90-second break here. I think that's correct, David. And we're going to invite our college groups who have been with us just to say thank you for them being with us, but that they can feel free to go ahead and break out into their discussion groups now. And we'll just take a little pause here before we continue with some additional questions and answers. a couple of comments have been made in the chat, Marie, and I just wanted to reference back to that. Noel had written about World Beyond War has been putting up billboards that 3% of the US military budget would end hunger on the planet. And what we've seen over and over again is that if you invest your money in one type of solution, you look for ways to enact that solution. And you had talked a little bit about that, about that it's time to the way we handle these situations reflect what we invest in. Could you say just a little bit more about that? And I'm thinking in particular that we've got evidence of this, and maybe point people to some of the folks like Chenoweth and Marie Stefan and A Force More Powerful that talk about alternative things. And I'm thinking in particular, I was in the Philippines in 2017 and learned so much about the people power revolution and how the Catholic Church for, I think, 2 generations had been training their people in nonviolence, so that when the opportunity arose to depose Marcos, the revolution that took place was largely a bloodless and nonviolent revolution, but it was because the Catholic Church and Cardinal Sin had been training people in nonviolence as much as they were training them in sacramental preparation and learning scripture and religious study and whatnot. Could you just say maybe a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's certainly true, and that really was the basis of our decision in whenever it was 2014, 15, when we thought of how many times we had, as a war was about to begin, said, war is not the answer. War is not the answer. Don't go to war. How many times we tried to reduce the military budget and so on. And we looked around to try to decide, how could we make a difference? How could we be heard more? And on the one hand, the basic work is always done at a grassroots level. It was the people in the parishes in the Philippines that went out in the street and put flowers in the guns of the soldiers. But the institutional church has such reach that we thought it was at least worth a try to see if the church would, at a global level, would do what Cardinal Sin did in the Philippines, which was to take seriously the need to learn about nonviolence, to train for nonviolence, and to use all of the tools that the church has: universities, seminaries, communications capacity, advocacy. And the church is in almost every country in the world and has access to high-level decision makers as well as to the grassroots people, and on and on. So it was really that belief that that the church could make a difference. I think a challenge that you referenced, Johnny, that I think is a really, really important one is the phenomenal statistic, 3% of the military budget. That's amazing. One of the big challenges that we've had in this project, one of the last references I made, and Johnny put all the references in the chat, was to our policymakers tool to try to help think through what are the kinds of policies that would give a base to a nonviolent approach to security, to inclusive security. And one that's obvious is the military budget. We knew that was there, but what we're looking for, and we still are, although they're examples, is so if the money does not go to the preparations for war and the military, where should we be spending that money in order to, at a policy level, at a structural level, understand the potential for nonviolence? And so for me, there are a few examples in the State Department, and I'm not going to remember them right now, but the Complex Crisis Fund and the atrocity prevention mechanisms that are small programs but within the U.S. State Department are maybe a step in the right direction. I think some of the work that the U.S. Institute of Peace is doing is very interesting around nonviolence and peace building. But for example, it has always been disturbing to me that in the cabinet, the people who give advice to the president in times of crisis, there is very little experience with nonviolent, with the power of nonviolence. Maria Stephan, you asked me to mention Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan, two brilliant researchers, did a study that was mentioned the week that Michelle was on. There were three young people who were in a conversation, and that week someone mentioned the research by Maria Stephan and Erica Chenoweth called Why Civil Resistance Works. They looked at all of the major efforts in the 20th century and a little bit longer to either oust a standing government or make a major change in the management of a country. And they demonstrated empirically that nonviolent means were twice as effective as violent means. So their research, and others are doing good research, but we need much more research. We need to know where should we spend the money? What should we have done? We can lay out what might be a just peace analysis of Ukraine that is helpful and very specific, but that needs to be much more robust. It needs to be fleshed out in much more detail. We need to figure out how long will it take us to go from a completely militarized way of approaching the world to a nonviolent way of approaching the world, both as a single nation and then as the family of nations. Another big one is the reform of the United Nations. The setup of the United Nations reflects who won the Second World War. So power is built in to the UN Security Council in a way that makes it completely ineffective in crisis situations like in Ukraine. So all of those questions are the places where we need to be investing thought, brilliant intellect, research, and financial resources until we understand how do we do this differently. It's like rebuilding redoing the 20th century in many ways. It's a big job, but we can do it if we start. If we never start, we will never get there.
And I'm just noticing, just on this call, for instance, Marie, that I think the seeds of how to live nonviolently are planted in it's some of the witness of some of the people that I'm just glancing through some of the participants in here. And I see members of intentional communities like the Catholic Worker or like Assisi on the call. I see especially, the witness that women religious have had. The Sisters of St. Francis of the Holy Cross are with us tonight, and how it is that women religious have carried that charism of nonviolence in every aspect, from spirituality to tactics to, personal commitment. That it is these little seeds that are sort of everywhere, and watering them, getting them to grow, and amplifying them and holding them up as the way that we get through our lives on a daily basis. It's only unfortunately at the higher levels that we start to think violence is the answer to things. Most of us don't go through our days thinking the way to get through this is by violently acting out or whatnot.
Right.
So yeah,
exactly.
So Maria, I just wanted to say thank you so much. You've given so much for us to think about and to chew on here around nonviolence. And thank you especially for your personal witness and your leadership around this and bringing this to the forefront. It's a conversation that's happening in the church in a robust way that wasn't just 5 years ago. And we're so, so grateful for that. So I'm going to invite Noel or David to come on and to offer any final comments. But so grateful for you, Marie. Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Johnny. Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank you so much, Marie. What a great way to end this series with your presentation. What you discussed and brought up kind of wraps up everything that was presented through the last 7 weeks with the emphasis and on the care of the earth and the nonviolence that we need to develop for that. And just giving us the hope of what is really the great things that are happening with the dialogue with the Vatican, with the bishops. So it's a great way. We could talk all night. But as you mentioned, this is a long process. So it's okay for us to break away for now, and we'll continue, continue our efforts. So, and thank you, Johnny, for a great job moderating and also just adding into the discussion with Marie on all of this and your the postings you put into the chat for references. And again, thank you so much, everyone. And we'll see you and have a good, blessed remainder of your Holy Week, and take care.
Thank you.
All
Bye.
right.